Are you ever trying to pick something on Netflix, but you just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and watching ads, and eventually you end up watching the same thing you've been watching for the past 10 years? Launching a podcast can feel just like that. You're on the hamster wheel of topics, episode ideas, audience, how you're going to promote it, editing, the list goes on and on. Respectfully, my friend, this episode, we're stopping the procrastination cycle. I'm taking away the remote, and I'm telling you exactly how I'd launch a podcast by next month. Hello, and welcome to Podcast for Profit. My name is Morgan Franklin. I'm a podcast producer, strategist, and educator. This podcast will help you create and grow a podcast that cuts through the noise of social media and speaks directly to your target audience. If you're ready to create a podcast that will align you with the experts in your industry, position yourself as a trusted leader, and create another source of revenue for your business, you're in the right place. So we have 4 weeks to launch a podcast. No problem. We can do this, and this is exactly how we're going to do it. Before we get started, I need everyone to understand this is the get it done method. I don't always recommend the get it done method, but if you're the kind of kid that was always waiting until the night before a project was due, or you thrive under high pressure situations, or you just need a strict deadline to get things accomplished, this launch strategy is probably for you. Week 1. The first week, we're figuring out exactly what this podcast is going to be and who's going to listen to it. We can do this a few different ways, and I like to call this the chicken or the egg method. You either need to have a topic in mind that you know corresponds to your skill set, business, or content, or even a defined audience that you already are serving. Sometimes this overlaps and you have exactly what you want your podcast to be about, and sometimes it doesn't. The best advice I can give you is to niche down. I know it's scary. Your podcast isn't for everyone, and that is okay. This is why more than half of podcasts that start quit within the same year. You start a podcast because you want to have a podcast, and then you realize you have no idea why you're doing it or who it's for. No one is listening, and you don't know what to make content about. That's why your first priority, week 1, is to know exactly the person that will be listening to your podcast. You need to know everything. What's their age, gender, race, education level, salary? What do they do for fun? What do they want to learn about? Give them a name. Know your audience and tailor your topic for your audience. And don't stop there. Find out what you don't know about them. What does your audience struggle with? What questions of theirs can you answer before they even ask? How can you build a connection that is valuable to your audience and makes them want to come back to your podcast every week? One of the easiest ways to figure this out is to look at the podcasts your future audience is listening to and study them. What content is your audience consuming? What's their favorite podcast? Why is it their favorite podcast? How can you replicate that success? How can you create more of that? I don't want this to be misinterpreted as I'm telling you to copy another creator, because I am absolutely not. I am saying see what's working and analyze that. See what you like and dissect why you like it. We don't have to remake the wheel. Everything has already been done, but it hasn't been done by you, and that is the secret ingredient. At the end of week 1, you need to have a breakdown of your target audience, a podcast topic that's built to serve and grow with that audience, and a solid list of other podcasts your ideal audience would be listening to, and what you want to have in common with those shows. Week 2. The second week is all about finding the right equipment and outlining your first episodes. I have several equipment guides at different price points that I'll link in the show notes that will help you find a complete podcasting system. Which system you choose is totally based on the show and what your monetization goals are. There are no right or wrong answers. You can record your podcast on your laptop in the beginning, but the second week needs to be focusing on trial and error. Record a few minutes and check the audio quality. Record a whole test episode. Set up the equipment where it's actually going to be and test this out. This is such a critical step. And take it from me, someone that has tested out a lot of equipment and tried and failed and tried and failed again, you need the practice. While you're practicing setting up your equipment and making sure that you have the ability to properly record an episode, you need to be working on your first episode outlines. For a solo show, I like to have a topic that's broken into 3 manageable sections around a central point. Your listener can only take in so much information, and you need to present it in an organized way. So let's say your podcast is about writing a book, and your podcast episode is about finding a publisher. For this example, you don't have to tell every single thing about finding a book publisher. You couldn't anyway. It's impossible. But instead, highlight 3 pain points. So for example, how to know when it's time to look for a publisher, what to look for in a publisher, what a publisher might provide to you as an author. From there, you can break it down even further into multiple questions of each one of these sections. And that's your episode. This is a topic that you can come back to as many times as you want. But having an episode that's too overwhelming and has way too much information isn't going to do anything for your listener, and it's going to be a huge headache for you trying to figure out how to record it. I encourage every podcaster I work with to have at least 10 episode ideas written down on a piece of paper before they start recording, and 4 episodes completely recorded by the time they launch. Podcasting is intense, and you need this reminder to your earlier self who was doing all this stuff and had all these ideas why you're making this podcast. You can do this, but you have to set yourself up for success. So at the end of week 2, you need to have 10 podcast episode ideas. So that is just the topic idea. Don't worry about anything else. From those 10 episodes, pick 4 that you will be breaking down further into 3 sections and writing notes from those sections. This is going to be your first 4 episodes. By the end of week 2, you should have done at least 1 practice recording with your equipment, and make sure that everything is working and that you know how to use it and that this place is going to be conducive to recording. This doesn't have to be a real episode, but it should be a real recording. Week 3, we're halfway there. This is going to be your busiest and most exciting week because we're finally starting to put all the pieces together. To start off this week, we're going to do some housekeeping and pick a podcast hosting platform. I personally use Buzzsprout, and I've had a great experience with them, but there are dozens of podcast hosting platforms. They're all slightly different, but generally all have the same objective to distribute your podcast to all the major podcasting networks like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, etc. I get a lot of questions from people on how is their podcast going to be distributed, and that's how. You just pick a podcast hosting platform, you pay the monthly rate, you upload the podcast, and they do the rest for you. So this is where you're going to establish your RSS feed, which is where your podcast lives on the internet. Once you get on your podcast hosting platform, this is very, very important. Take your time to fill out each one of these sections about your podcast and properly take the time to name your podcast, look it over for any mistakes. I see so many podcasters that aren't taking the time to even write in their about section for their show. Why would anyone ever listen to your podcast if you're not taking the 5 minutes to explain what it's about? And don't use ChatGPT or AI. Use your brain and write a captivating about section and tell people why they need to listen to your show. Tell people what you are going to provide to them. Because again, people can tell when it's AI, and that will turn them off as quickly as you not even having an about section. During this process of setting up your podcast, your host is going to ask for your podcast cover art. Again, this is very important. You know it's important. It's the first thing people will see when they see your podcast. In a perfect world, you're able to hire a graphic designer and a photographer and a fully produced cover, but that isn't the world most of us live in. So look at podcast covers. See what you like about them and replicate what's working. Use Canva. get creative, but take time to do this intentionally because this is your podcast's visual brand and it matters. If you have no idea where to start, check out something like Fiverr, which is where you can go and hire an independent artist and pay them a small commission. Or if you have a local community college or university that has a business course or an art department with a graphic design program, reach out to them. See if they're taking on any projects. Get scrappy with this, but put some time and effort into making it the best that you can. Lastly, we're going to be recording your first 4 podcast episodes. This will be terrifying, exciting, and probably feel a little awkward. And that's okay. The journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, and this is your first step. Don't be hard on yourself. Be proud of yourself. You are doing something that so many other people only wish they could do. So even if you have a huge, major stinker of a first episode where you absolutely bomb, you can always try again, or you can move on knowing next time you're going to do an even better job. None of us are born knowing how to podcast or speak into a microphone or create content. You will learn every step of this journey, and someday you're going to look back on how far you've come. But for now, get your podcast notes and a big glass of water and press record. At the end of week 3, you should have a podcast hosting platform selected and paid for. You should have set up your podcast and your RSS feed with an optimized podcast name, about section, and cover art. You should have recorded your first 4 episodes and have them ready to export. Week 4. We're finally at week 4 and we're in the home stretch to launch day. This week, you're focusing on editing, exporting, and scheduling your launch week. Pick which day of the next week you're going to be launching your podcast. Personally, I like to air all of my podcasts on Monday mornings. I love Mondays. I love a new week, and it seems right for my brand. Fridays might be right for you. Wednesdays or Sundays, whatever day of the week it is, make sure that it's a day that works with your schedule. And this is a good day to consistently air your episodes on and probably have a little work the night before. Now that you have your first 4 episodes recorded, you're ready to edit. If you don't take anything else from this episode, please listen to this entire thing. Podcasting in general, you have to go one day at a time. You will learn so much between episode 1 and episode 2, and episode 2 and episode 3, and episode 3 and episode 4. Editing is time consuming, and it will eat you alive if you let it. So don't let it. Start with editing out the big mistakes and anything you absolutely don't want in your episode. Take some time to learn about the equipment you're using and your editing software. I personally use Adobe Audition, but you can download Audacity for free. And in the beginning, if you're on a budget, I'd encourage you to do that because Adobe can get very expensive. I think the suite is now $70 a month. So make sure that you're picking an editing platform that is going to work with your podcast and your budget. When you're finished editing your episode, you still have a bit more work for this first episode. You need to pick intro and outro music if you're going to have it and decide what the intro and closing of your podcast will look like. This is different for every show. And again, I encourage you to think about your audience, what they like, what they're expecting, what makes sense, what the vibe of your show is, and use that information to guide your decisions. Again, make sure you're taking a minute to upload the episode and properly title and include an intriguing description in the show notes. That first sentence needs to be iconic. Sometimes that's all people see when they're going to click on your episode is that first sentence. So you need to hook them and make sure they can't resist hitting play. The last thing is don't forget to spend some time preparing for launch day. I know this has been a long 4 weeks and you deserve to take a beat, but this is not the time. I want you to be rallying the troops. You're drumming up excitement. You're making posts telling people you have a podcast coming out. You need to have the spirit of a high school cheerleader the week of homecoming. At the end of week 4, you should have at least one completed, finished podcast episode ready to launch the following week with optimized audio and copy that is scheduled in your hosting platform. This is possible. Will it be easy? Probably not. But you can do things that aren't easy. And you can do this. One thing that I want you to start on today, because I know this is a lot of information to talk about, I want you to get out a piece of paper and write down your answer to these questions. Make a few goals for your podcast, the podcast that you've been thinking about this entire episode. And I don't want you to be realistic. We have no time for you to be realistic. This is your wild, big dreams, and this is what we are going to make a reality. The first question is, how does your podcast help people? The second question is, how does your podcast help you? The third question is, how much money are you making per episode? And let me be the first one to tell you, I can't wait to listen to your podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and you'd like to hear more episodes like this one, go ahead and subscribe to the show. New episodes air every Monday morning. And if you found this episode valuable and you want to help other business owners and podcasters, will you leave me a 5-star review? It helps the show rank higher in the charts and brings more entrepreneurs the information they need to start making money on their podcast.